So just want to show you guys what we got going on in the works here that should be available in the next probably week or so once we get all the parts. We got our prototype laid out on this one. Should be pretty similar to what the full retail kits are going to be, minus packaging and a couple other little details. Anyway, this is the ScooterSwapShop exclusive pressure test kit for testing two-stroke engines to make sure that you're all sealed up after your build. No air leaks or anything like that. Air leaks are, I'd have to say, probably the #1 cause of two-stroke failure, other than maybe jetting tuning. Anyway, two-strokes super picky for air leaks. If you have air leaks, it basically is letting in extra air, base gasket, crank seals, anywhere in the intake manifold that the carburetor can't compensate for. So it's going to run very lean. If you add extra fuel, you can sort of compensate for it, but your bike's basically never going to run correctly with air leaks. What this kit allows you to do is pressurize the crankcase up to a certain spec, which is about 6 psi or so, and basically let the pressure sit in there and see if there's any drop in pressure, aka an air leak anywhere in your system. What we have here is 2 billet adapters with 2 sizes each. You're going to have your regular PWK style from 24 to 28 millimeter PWK, and then the larger size is going to be for 30 millimeter plus PWK. These fit great. You have your smaller size for stock intake manifolds and CP size intake manifolds. So this kit will fit 90% of automatic scooter carburetor setups. So this guy has a little pressure pump to basically add pressure into the crankcase and have it accurately measured as far as what crankcase pressure is actually dropping. So this is a prototype. We should have the retail versions available in about a week to a week and a half or so once we get the rest of the parts available. Basically what you're gonna do with this here, after you've built your engine, everything's all sealed up with Honda Bond, including anything on the intake manifold, base gasket, you reinforce the head gasket a little bit, and crank seals are installed and all that good stuff. So this is Jay Morman's pre-bug engine, MXS race. Should be a nice quick 65-75 mile an hour pre-bug build. So show you how this works a little bit. The kit's going to come with, like I said, the 2 adapters for the intake manifold, pressure pump, all the hoses and adapters you need, all that kind of good stuff. It's going to also come with an exhaust block-off plate. This exhaust block-off plate is going to be used in conjunction with silicone, so it basically seals off your exhaust side. Alternately, if you have a weird cylinder or something like that, you can use it with your exhaust, the exhaust stub installed and a rubber plug in that. So we've made these to fit most scooter, Minarelli, all the way up to Big Stroker. So that should work for most scooters, but if you have one that doesn't, it's pretty easy to get a rubber fitting to actually block off your exhaust. So you're going to want to make sure you block off your exhaust, have a fresh spark plug installed, and tighten down so the crush washer's all sealed up. Make sure your motor's at bottom dead center, so it has the most room to fill up with air, and also to make sure that the air actually goes into the bottom end, not just into the top end. Usually if the piston's upwards, the air pressure once you put it in the top end will sort of make the piston go down, but you want to try to make sure just by default that your motor's already in bottom dead center. So once you have the exhaust plate installed, spark plug installed, motor at bottom dead center, find whichever adapter is going to fit your intake manifold. In this case, it's the size for the regular smaller PWK carburetors. Install it in your intake manifold. Make sure it's installed all the way. Nice tight fit. And then go ahead and just lightly clamp down. You don't need to go too tight. They're pretty tight fit, so you could probably do it without a hose clamp. The hose clamp will make sure it doesn't pop out. Anything on your intake manifold, if you're going to be using a vacuum fitting, make sure you have your plugs in here, because obviously that will fake itself like an air leak. So make sure anything that's the vacuum line, spark plugs installed, all that kind of good stuff. Once you have this installed in there, you can go ahead and just pump up the gauge. This gauge is in millimeters of mercury. 300 millimeters of mercury equals roughly 6 psi. So on these gauges, you're basically going to want to go all the way back around, pump it up, and you're looking for 6 psi in the crankcase. So on these gauges, you're just going to want to go back to 0 pretty much. And there's a little bit of, it drops down a little bit, but once you have it exactly where you want it, just take note of where it's sitting and let it sit there, put the gauge down. And if you have an air leak, usually you'll see the gauge will drop down in front of your eyes unless it's a very, very, very minor air leak. So this guy, I've got it set pretty much to 0. There is a pressure bleed on the pump, so if you want to get it to an exact number, you can just bleed off a little bit, like put it straight to 300. So you can get it even right there. And like I said, that's about 6 PSI. It's like 5.8 exactly, but just about 6 PSI. Tighten down that. Let your gauge sit here. Don't touch it. Don't move the crank around or anything like that. You want to let it sit here for about 10 minutes or so. And it shouldn't drop much more than about, I don't know, 20 or so millimeters of mercury. You're looking for less than 1 PSI of drop over 10 minutes. So if you have an air leak, like I said, you'll normally be able to look at the gauge and physically see it trickling down slowly. So if you don't see it within the first 5 minutes or so, dropping, a couple bars or whatever, then you're usually pretty good. This motor is sealed up. I've already pressure tested it, so not going to be a perfect example of how exactly to find where your air leak is. But if you do see your gauge dropping down, get yourself a spray bottle with soap, a decent amount of soap in it, and just regular tap water, and just start spraying down all the common spots. The first, if you do have a noticeable air leak, the first thing I like to check is obviously where you have your pressure test equipment plugged in. So the hoses, any fittings and stuff like that on your pressure test equipment, just make sure it's good to go there. And obviously the exhaust little block off plate, just make sure that's blocked off correctly. What you'll see if you have an air leak is little tiny bubbles coming out, like if you've ever checked a flat tire or a nail in a tire, you'll just see little bubbles, soapy water bubbles start. So the common areas, other than obviously the pressure test equipment, that's the very first stuff you want to check, because if your pressure test equipment is leaking, that will throw you off on that one. So just make sure your exhaust is blocked off, and it's not bubbling anywhere on the bottom, top, sides, anything like that, and the intake manifold here. So like I said, this one doesn't leak, so it won't really show us anything here. But second most common spot, you want to check the base gasket, your crankcase halves for sealing, because all these two strokes, you basically are using Honda Bond, ideally, not RTV, for the crankcase half. So you want to just basically spray down the crank in the middle, spray down the base gasket, spray down the head gasket, double check that your spark plug's sealed up. If there's scratches on the head where the spark plug goes in, or you're using like a Trail Tech tempering, double check that that's sealing first too, because that'll throw you off and drive you crazy if it's just the tempering that's leaking. If you have an older motor, obviously a fresh build is going to be pretty good to go, but if you have an older motor that doesn't have new crank seals, you want to double check that the crank seals are sealing. This is all brand new, so it's good to go. Crank seals are a pretty common spot, especially when they're older, for an two-stroke engine to leak. Another really important spot to check would be all the mating surfaces on the intake manifold. So most of these two-stroke scooter intake manifolds are going to have vulcanized rubber reed cage. I don't like trusting just that rubber, so even if it's got a vulcanized cage, I'll like to reinforce that with Honda Bond on both sides of it, and then same with these spigot style manifolds. It's got a vulcanized rubber on it, but I like to reinforce that with Honda Bond just to make sure, because it's only got 2 spots here and it can kind of bow out in the middle. If you have a nice piece of Honda Bond, especially where there's no bolts kind of in the middle of it, that'll make sure everything's sealed up there. So if you have an air leak, just kind of spray down all the spots here, make sure you don't see any bubbles, and unless it's a very, very minute air leak, you'll usually see bubbles pretty much right away. But you can see this one, hopefully in the video, this one's holding 300 right on the line. So it's always a good idea to wait your full 10 minutes, but if you see that the needle's not moving at all, I'll usually call it within 5 minutes. So if there's no movement within 5 minutes, usually good to go. Like I said, there's no harm in waiting the full 10 minutes to see if you have drop. But if you have 1 or 2 bars on this gauge drop in 10 minutes, that's no problem at all. Like I said, if you start getting 10 to 20 bars on this one, then you have an air leak somewhere that you'd like to find out. Ideally, you don't want to see any drop at all, but the spec is 1 PSI out of 6 in 10 minutes. If I have that, usually I'll try to find out where that's leaking, because I don't like having two strokes with any air leak at all. Sometimes it's very hard to locate it. And then, like I said before, you want to just double check there's not even minute air leaks in this setup. So we'll make sure when these ship, they're going to ship with good instructions. They're going to be all sealed up and tested. I tested this gauge overnight, loaded to 5 psi, and it didn't leak at all. So I'm confident this setup is good to go, but we'll make sure when they ship, like I said, they're not going to have leaks in the pressure test setup. We haven't had a chance to figure out the MSRP on this setup, but it should be right around the $100 price point. If you look around for two-stroke pressure test equipment, first of all, there's none available for automatic scooters. The only stuff you can buy is meant for two-stroke dirt bike motors, and it's upwards of $250, $300. So we wanted to come out with an option that's good, that's got a good price point, and that works out of the box for scooter motors, which we know you guys are building just about exclusively scooter motors. So yeah, there's that setup. We'll post a little bit more about it, and once we have all the parts available, we already have the intake adapters. We need to still get some more gauges, and then just set up packaging and how we want to sell them and ship them. So yeah, if you guys have any questions, feel free to post up in the comments.